Within fiction as a whole, there are a lot of strong characters. And within fiction, we have characters like, say, Son Goku from Dragon Ball, who's basically the face of not only anime, but the strong main character trope, alongside other characters such as Superman and so on and so forth. And ever since 2015, which it's mad that it was 9 years ago at this point, one character was popularized due to his manga and webcomic series becoming an anime with really good animation. I'll give it credit. That character is Saitama, and his anime One Punch Man. Not only is Saitama the main character of the series, but he's also the strongest character within the series as a whole. But within the last 9 years since the first season was released back in 2015, fans of the series have been putting Saitama against characters like, say, Goku, Superman, Ichigo, Naruto, and so on and so forth, and saying that Saitama would basically one-shot these characters without any effort. So, in this video, I will be talking about some of the misconceptions about Saitama scaling, especially when it comes to the redraw manga, since that's where a lot of the misconceptions come from. And that's mostly what people talk about when they are referring to Saitama as a whole. And I'll be comparing Saitama's strength to an outerverse setting at the end of the video. Now, starting this off with the many misconceptions and ways to scale Saitama, people have a tendency to bring up the fact that Saitama broke his limiter and therefore scaling Saitama to such an insane level of strength that it just seems unreasonable. Some people try and say that Saitama, because of this, is an unbeatable character that doesn't have a limit. And people, if they are power scalers like myself, use this to either scale Saitama to high universal or even to outerversal in some arguments. The way people do actually try and argue this, like basically outerversal status for Saitama is saying, as I said, him breaking his limiters, which they assume is high universal right off the bat. But since God was implanting basically source of knowledge, he would be Saitama himself would be breaking basically forms of physics and basically scaling that to outerversal indirectly. But the problem with these arguments is that it's assuming breaking Saitama's limiter does in fact scale Saitama's attack potency and just overall capabilities as a fighter. But people have to understand that the whole limiter idea, the limiter theory that was brought up within the series, only actually refers to the limit of someone's growth and the potential of their growth and how strong they can get. It doesn't actively give someone limitless strength if they do, in fact, remove their limiter. It just gives them limitless potential. Potential and strength are two completely different things. You can have the potential to be strong, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are strong right off the bat. This alone debunks the idea of outerversal or high universal Saitama via this method. Potential does not equate to strength, and I would say vice versa, but that isn't necessarily true. But yeah, potential does not having limitless potential does not equate to having a limitless strength. You can reach insane levels of power via having this limitless potential, but that doesn't necessarily scale you off the bat. Another way Saitama fans have a tendency to argue Saitama's scaling being higher than it actually is saying that Saitama has infinite and or limitless strength, going off of statements from, say, Garo or Boros quoting he having limitless strength or immeasurable power, or Guide saying he has infinite strength. But this is relatively problematic for a lot of reasons. Well, yes, Saitama might have seemingly limitless strength, within the context of the verse, he does have finite strength if you actually think about it. Like, yes, it might seem like he has infinite strength for the other characters, but he does have a limit. And the reason why they say he has infinite strength is because he is so, like, incomprehensibly strong in comparison to the other characters. It's just that it seems like he has infinite strength. And the reason why I say he has finite strength is because it's actively proven within the series. An example of Saitama having finite strength instead of actual infinite strength is the fact that Saitama was continually growing in strength in his fight with Cosmic Fear Garo. So, as I said, Saitama was just growing in power throughout the latter half of that fight. If you are trying to argue Saitama having actual infinite strength, like if as in like the proper definition, or at least the first definition that comes up if you search infinite or infinity, the fact that Saitama grows in power would contradict that, since you can't add on to true infinity and expect a different result. If something is truly infinite, then there's no need to add on to it. And the same can be said about the fact that Saitama holds back. If Saitama is truly infinitely strong, then he would instantly pulverize every one of his opponents, no matter how much he quote unquote holds back. But the fact that his strength fluctuates and does change depending on who he's fighting does, in fact, contradict the fact that he has quote unquote true infinite strength, because you can't subtract from true infinity, just like how you can't add on to true infinity. And to continue this point, people have a tendency to say that he has like limitless strength, but as I said, he does have a limit. And Saitama did state outright that he would go all out against Cosmic Fear Garo when they landed on one of Jupiter's moons. And Saitama was actively showing struggling with Cosmic Fear Garo before that ability of growing stronger truly kicked in. And because of that, because of him stating he'll go all out, and struggling with Garu for the majority of the fight, he obviously has some sort of limits. You can't go all out while still having limitless infinite strength. Now, there are also multiple meanings to the term infinite. There's true infinite, so like limitless and or endless, and then there's infinite as in just very great, which is what I was saying earlier on. And since Saitama seemingly has a limit and still grows in power, when characters refer to Saitama having infinite power or his power is limitlessly strong, they don't mean the most literal definition of the word. They likely just mean infinite as in very, very great. That's what I was saying beforehand. And assuming that he does beat everyone in fiction in a fight is just a no limits fallacy in itself. And to continue this point even further on, if having the if having like infinite statements is just the case for having infinite strength, then without like any further context to back it up, then characters within Dragon Ball, for example, would be beating Saitama ever since the Cell saga, since characters like Cell, specifically Perfect and Super Perk Cell, having infinite and bottomless power statements. But that's a whole different discussion for a different day, whether or not those statements are like these statements here. And some people might bring up a counter argument to what I'm saying there's different levels of infinities, therefore Saitama and his limits don't necessarily contradict Saitama having infinite strength, especially to the extent I'm saying it does. But this is a little weird, but still, like the reason why they say that is likely coming from the concept of, you know, set theory and having different sizes or cardinalities of infinity. For instance, the infinite of all real numbers is considered larger than the infinity of integrities or whatever. And in mathematics, there are different sizes of infinity as described as some mathematicians who worked on set theory. the concept of different levels of infinity arises when comparing the sizes of different sets. For example, this set of all real numbers has a larger cardinality than the set of, say, integrities or whatever it's pronounced. But the problem arises with this like infinite argument is that this line of thinking does not equate to infinite strength. It's mostly in reference to, say, cardinalities. But Saitama fans would still try to use this to argue Saitama having actual infinite strength without looking into the like history of different levels of infinity. And within the context of having different levels of infinity, while it is a fascinating concept in itself within mathematics, it does not serve as an appropriate analogy for describing Saitama's strength. These statements are directly tied to his narrative within the actual story and not his actual strength and scaling. Saitama literally does not have infinite strength, but just seems like he has infinite strength when compared to, say, town level characters. Now, another argument you might hear Saitama fans use to scale Saitama unreasonably high is via Cosmic Fear Garo. I've seen some arguments saying that since Garo is creating hyperspaces with his portals, and that Saitama was interacting with these portals, Saitama is at the bare minimum 40 or a universal plus. But the problem with this is that Saitama was only necessarily shown grabbing on to these portals and just kicking them around the fucking place as if it was a football. He was never actually shown harming or destroying the hyperspaces, just moving the portals around the place. And destroying the hyperspaces themselves, or at least being stated to be able to destroy the hyperspaces themselves with previous feats backing up, is what is actively needed to scale that high. All Saitama was necessarily doing was interacting and moving the portals around. It's just non physical interaction, as in the ability, not his physical strength destroying a fourth dimensional realm, basically. Like, think about it like this: say you have a house, like a nice ass house, and you go to the front door and you like start opening it, or for the sake of argument, destroying the door. Like, does that make you building level? The answer is no, you're just interacting with the door, that's all. The same applies to Saitama in this case. The analogy applies since he was just interacting with the portals, in this case, the doors, in the case of the analogy, and the hyperspaces themselves were the house. So the gates, you know, he was just interacting with the gates, and he wasn't even destroying the gates themselves. He was just interacting with them. The next feat that I want to bring up that is less contentious but still rather debunkable is the series punch squared feat. People tend to use this to scale Saitama relatively high, but firstly, he doesn't necessarily scale to the full blast of it. It was Saitama and Cosmic Vergaro clashing at the same time, using roughly the same amount of power to perform this feat. But even then, this feat is really debunkable, really. Now, as you could tell by the image we're shown of the Sirius Punch Squared, allegedly destroying the stars and showing the void here. However, the stars were not actually destroyed. This is shown via the following chapters, specifically chapter 167 and 168, which shows us the stars shining in the background as these fuse zooms in on Garo from the direction of their fight, which happens in the complete opposite direction from the blast, because they're launched by like the blast to Jupiter. This means that it couldn't have destroyed the stars by but merely pushing them back and or temporarily getting rid of the light just for that moment, which the latter is likely considering Blast and his friends talk about changing the vector of the direction of the destructive blast and use an unknown power to us as the audience for the time being. We know that Blast did not necessarily send it away via the portal because he himself states the gates cannot withstand such energy. No, it's just the gates, not necessarily the hyperspaces themselves. So, based off the information and the context we're given of the scene and the chapters and so on, the blast and seemingly the light from the stars were just redirected for the vector manipulation of sorts. Even so, if you disregard this feat, you cannot disregard the fate of the stars. The fact that the stars were reappearing later on in the fight between Garo and Saitama, which does debunk the stars being destroyed. But even if you want to say that the blast did destroy the stars, this wouldn't necessarily scale the characters past galaxy level. Some people might ask, why is that? Well, most arguments getting this fate to, say, multi-galaxy level or universal is just via things like, say, the Hubble telescope, or assuming every star in our galaxy or other galaxies have, say, solar systems. But that line of thinking isn't necessarily true, since there are examples of stars in our galaxy alone, let alone other galaxies, not necessarily having planets to orbit around it, creating solar systems. An example would be O type stars. There are 20,000 different O type stars within our galaxy alone, and depending on the luminosity of the O type star, it usually dictates the lifespan and of the star itself. The least luminous ones do have a lifespan of about 10 million years maximum, with the most luminous stars having a lifespan of less than a million. For reference, going off of, say, reports and documents you can easily find online made by NASA themselves, it takes about a few tens of millions of years for planets to actually form around a star, meaning that a planet, when it begins forming around these like O type stars, especially the least luminous ones, like the O type star in question will either be close to dying or would already be dead, so there's no point in the planet like forming around it. Meaning that not every star in every galaxy has planets orbiting, like being around them, really, and creating solar systems. As for the Hubble telescope argument, while the Hubble telescope is a useful tool for us humans IRL, the Hubble telescope is still a flawed way to argue this feat, and is still a flawed tool in general, even though it's still quite useful in comparison. You see, the Hubble telescope itself, ever since it was originally launched, was still considered by NASA themselves to be flawed. Like, seriously, months after it was launched, NASA announced the Hubble telescope was flawed. Both Hubble's images cameras showed characteristic distortion, showing a major flaw within the Hubble telescope and how accurate it was, especially for the time. And even then, the blast caused by the Sirius Punch Squared was too limited to actively reach what the Hubble telescope could see. Galaxies, distant galaxies, and the distance between galaxies themselves, and solar systems, and the distance between the solar systems, while it can be seen by things like the Hubble telescope, is way too large for the blast to actually cover in a short time frame, considering what were actually shown from the Sirius Punch Squared, as well as the size of the blast. And saying that the Sirius Punch Squared blast reached to distant galaxies isn't totally accurate and isn't truthful to the actual scaling of One Punch Man. And it's just a weird way to scale Saitama and Garo to multi-galaxy level or above. Now, after the main Garo Saitama fight, Garo realized, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, and did actively teach Saitama the ability to travel back in time. Now, people do try and use this to argue Saitama having immeasurable levels of speed due to this. If you aren't aware of what immeasurable speed refers to, as defined by character stats and profile as well as versus battle wiki, immeasurable speed is movement beyond movement unbound by linear time itself, which cannot be measured given that speed equals distance via over time. If t is undefined, the speed formula cannot be applied. This is the same reason why multiple temporal dimensions also grant immeasurable speed, depending on who you ask, of course. Obviously, referring to the raw speed and doesn't necessarily refer to the help of any ability. But there is a major issue when it comes to this quote unquote fate of Saitama moving back in time. This is simply just an ability. Even Garo himself refers to it as a technique when he was explaining it to Saitama as an ability. Like, seriously, multiple times he just refers to it as a technique, as in an ability, not his raw speed. While yes, Saitama's particles were technically moving, it doesn't necessarily mean Saitama has immeasurable speed. That would likely that's like someone arguing Goku having immeasurable speed ever since the Goku Blackheart, since Goku was existing outside of Trunks' time machine, and since he was technically breathing and his chest was going up and down, that means he was moving, therefore immeasurable speed. It's like that sort of argumentation. And the last major piece of scaling people use for Saitama, mainly the manga variation, is using Genesis hypothesis post Garo and Saitama fight, and trying to use that to argue Saitama transcending causality and likely things like space and time via the time travel ability. But if you read the hypothesis in full, at certain points, Geno seems to be a little unsure of certain things, suggesting that he isn't totally confident about the hypothesis as a whole. And he was even admitting during certain parts that he doesn't know certain things. For example, like the diversions of the timelines being occurred, meaning that he is partially basing some of the hypothesis off of the assumptions. When making a hypothesis, you actually need to prove a lot of it via knowledge or basing it off of concrete and provable evidence that is somewhat involved into the hypothesis itself and not just baseless assumptions. Meaning, if you were to actively use this, it would likely be a very, very flawed way due to the amount of assumptions Genos was making on his behalf. And even then, Saitama was not literally transcending things like causality. He was just moving back in time. And it just seemed like he was fucking everything up. And even then, if you were to use Saitama in a crossverse setting, he doesn't necessarily have the time travel ability on deck. He can't use it since ever since he traveled back in time, he fused with his past self, basically forgetting the ability as a whole. So, considering everything I have said in this video so far, where would Saitama realistically scale in an outerverse setting? So, in like a crossverse setting, if we were to put him against, say, Superman or Goku or whatever. One of the best feats performed by Saitama this far within One Punch Man is him performing the serious sneeze, which destroyed Jupiter down to its very core, which has been calced as high as Dwarf Star level plus, which you could argue is so somewhat supported by Lord Boris scaling, and the fact that a manga guy, that being the Hero Encyclopedia, stated that had Saitama not stopped the attack, the Earth might have been destroyed, which you could also argue is in turn supported by anime statements as well as the secret compass. But planetary or even star level Boros in itself is a very contentious topic, considering the original kanji used within things like the secret compass and so on and so forth. So, in conclusion, considering everything I said in this one video alone, Saitama is actively weaker than people think. he realistically scales his dwarf star level bare minimum, but you could probably argue he's maybe star level at full power, which I wouldn't necessarily be mad about, considering the fact that he did grow in power and a sneeze, no matter if it's a serious sneeze or a normal one, is still a sneeze. Like, it's not the full extent of your power, so there's that to consider as well. So, dwarf star level to star level Saitama is where he realistically scales.